Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, U.S. President Donald Trump signs legislation calling for sanctions over the treatment of Uyghurs. How will this impact China-U.S. relations? Casualties resulted when a clash broke out on the China-India border. How can the two nations address the problem? And this week's newsmaker, now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. Now a piece of breaking news. China's top legislature has reviewed the draft law on safeguarding national security in Hong Kong. And further details of the legislation have been unveiled. For that, joining me via satellite in Shanghai is Professor Chen Hong from East China Normal University. Welcome to the show, Professor Chen. So what's your takeaway from the review and also from this possible publishing of this national security law, the draft of the law?
I think actually this is an indication that the first reading of the draft is very important in that it indicates that the process of the national security law in the special administrative region of Hong Kong is now in the fast lane. And actually, what we need to do is actually to see that actually the situation, the scenario in Hong Kong needs to be brought under legislative control. That is actually the guarantee of the peaceful society and also the economic stability of Hong Kong. As we have been witnessing last year, there have been disruptive activities happening in Hong Kong. So actually, from the legislative level, once actually the laws have been in place, definitely that will be guarantee the stability of the society.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned about what happened over the past year, this violent protest and other related developments over there. So, for those who are not familiar probably with the situation in Hong Kong or with the national security law, they are afraid of whether this law will somehow rob Hong Kong citizens of their freedom or for their democratic rights. So, what's your response to those concerns?
I think actually the law, if you read the law carefully, you will see that actually it's to the largest extent have been guaranteeing the core value of one country, two systems. In that actually obviously in Hong Kong, there is this common law, while in the mainland we have got the civil law. While actually in the legislative, the draft the legislation, there is a clear indication that actually a kind of balance is going to be achieved to maintain actually a balance between these two systems. So in other words, two systems, one country. One country is actually being implemented in the practice, in that actually definitely there is going to be a lawful guarantee of the stability of the society. On the other hand, actually the local their way of life and also the way of legislation is being guaranteed.
Mm-hmm. Well, one country, two systems is the key not only to Hong Kong but also to China overall. Of course, as the NPC has said that national security law is actually to protect, to better implement one country, two systems in Hong Kong. So now let's come back to this our regular show. Against a background of containing the rise of China, the U.S. has introduced a new bill in the name of human rights concerns in Xinjiang. Washington has threatened to impose sanctions on the Chinese side if they fail to abide by U.S. laws. China has dismissed the U.S. move, characterizing it as an effort to intervene in Chinese affairs. So how will the latest U.S. move affect its relationship with China? And is the U.S. in a position to judge and lecture the world about human rights? Joining me now via satellite is Mario Cavallo, CEO of M Communications. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. So welcome to the show, Mario. So about later this week, actually, U.S. President Donald Trump signed this Uyghur Human Rights Act into law. So Mario, there are bills after bills over Chinese territories, including Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Now you have Xinjiang. So what do you make of this legislation?
This legislation is the type of typical legislation that keeps going through the political mill in Washington. It exists for political put-up purposes. It doesn't really accomplish anything. And to be frank with you, they know that. The political system in the United States for the last 20 years has steadily declined, become more corrupt and inept, and not efficient. They're not doing a good job of efficiently running their own country and running their own society. And part of what they have to do, of course, is keep the pressure on creating enemies outside of China. This is classic political strategy. And, you know, China's the easiest and most popular target right now. And there's different issues, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and then the Xinjiang situation. And again, they're loaded with half-truths, and a lot of what has been said, most of what's been said, has been completely debunked. So it's just more show and tell rather than anything of substance.
Yep, political strategies. So Professor Chen here, Xinjiang is a focus here, and the U.S. has presented it as an issue of human rights. But for a lot of people, a lot of Chinese people, about the fight against terrorism, the fight for peace and stability in Xinjiang. So what is the true story here?
I think actually since 1990, actually there had been a series of terrorist attacks in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and such terrorist attacks have been backed by foreign forces, actually with the particular aim to destabilize and even to topple the central government's administrative power in the region. So I think actually the local governments and also central government have been putting up a series of measures to prevent any of such attacks from happening, and that has been quite effective. For the past 3 years, actually, there have not been a single terrorist attack happening in Xinjiang. So that actually indicates a clear, the indication of the situation being in control, and also people being, there are 25 million people in Xinjiang of all ethnics, and people there actually long for a life of stability and also economic developments. So in that regard, I think actually we need to remember that actually those forces, especially the forces manipulated by the United States, trying to exert this kind of so-called long-arm jurisdiction to try to interfere with China's domestic affairs. That is actually with a particular agenda, with vested interest, that is actually to contain, suppress, and deter China's rise, making all kinds of trouble, for China.
Well, if you look at the situation in the U.S., and Mario, for example, there are opinion polls, basically, from by Gallup and Pew Research. Not long ago, they found out that 75% of Muslims in the U.S. believe they are under severe discrimination due to their religion. I'm not trying to target the United States, but I would say, every country, no country is perfect in terms of whatever record, economic development or religious or, human rights. But, I'm wondering if there are any bill on improving the Muslims in the U.S., improving their situation, or they are largely forgotten.
You present the question, which right away makes me think. I want to make a quick comparison. There's 3 categories of Uyghur citizens in Xinjiang, where, by the way, there's 24,000 open, live, active mosques. You go to the cities there, and there's a mosque every 1 kilometer. Open mosques, and of course nobody talks about this. I mean, they have a wonderful life there, but who am I referring to? The 3 categories of Uyghurs, and that is Uyghur Muslims, and that is the urban, regular, middle-class Uyghur Muslims like Chinese. And then you have migrant, Nongchuan, right, Uyghur migrants. And then you have Uyghur militants and extremists who are terrorists, who are like the protesters in America, where you have peaceful protesters, they're urban citizens. But then you have protesters who are looters and assaulting and even killing people and assaulting people. These are criminals. So China needs to deal with the Muslim terrorist militant criminals. Then they say, well, we're forcing the children into concentration camps. Well, what this kind of talk is disgraceful. Okay, in every you know, Qinduo, in every country, isn't it true that legally you're required to have your children be in school? It's legally required.
Right.
You can't say, oh, I want to take my kid out of school for the next couple of weeks. So the militant families, the militant Uyghur families, these are the criminals. And after they're dealt with and put in jails or internment camps, which is what happens in any country with criminals, the children need to be taken care of. So the government provides them with education. This is not forced internment. This is the government taking care of the children who they're victims because their parents are militant terrorists. Mm-hmm. And they try to flip it completely. And this same kind of thing happening in the United States.
Right. You know, another question, follow-up, for example, in the United States, you know, George Floyd, we know that, you know, it gave you an impression that you might be killed in the U.S. for $20, whether it's fake or not. I mean, most of the countries would say, no, you don't kill people by the police for $20. And also in the U.S., you have a complete debacle in 19. And then, you know, people are demanding justice in terms of the systematic of this injustice against black Americans. So I think in the U.S. Congress, in the White House, their hands are full to deal with their own issues. And if it's, you know, it gives the impression the U.S. is not effectively governing their own country, if not a failed state, to use the term to describe the country. But they are still, you know, somehow have time to try to intervene the Chinese affairs. So what makes them, you know, somehow they have this audacity to say you are not doing a good job?
Audacity is the right word. They have time and interest for political purposes to, I don't know, rile up their base for re-election purposes, to get involved in the affairs of other countries that are doing better than they are. You know, they say things like, oh, there's 1 million innocent men, women, and children in Xinjiang who are in concentration camps. First of all, this is a debunked lie for many, many months. This is a factually debunked lie, but yet you have 500,000 fast growing to 1 million homeless people in the United States, while you have oligarch billionaires who are making billions even in a day, their values going up by $1 billion. And then the country they have the nerve to talk about other countries and make false accusations about those countries at the same time. Here's what's really going on. The world does not want to and cannot accept the idea that America is a failed state. Check with all the wonderful articles in the Atlantic magazine in that regard. It's a very, very good reference there. Great work in Atlantic magazine. It is a failed state. It began 20 years ago. It's politically corrupt. It's economically corrupt. That's not China's fault. They have to divert from their problems at home, and that's what they're doing instead of focusing on their problems at home. I want to say it again. Almost rising fast to 1 million homeless people in the United States, while there's billionaires with billions of dollars doing absolutely nothing. What are they doing talking about Xinjiang?
Exactly. But Professor Chen, you know, obviously with the bill, the latest bill on Xinjiang, so it will have some impact on the relationship between China and the United States, right?
Yes, I think actually, you know, the United States has been trying to play various cards, like a Hong Kong card, Tibet card, you know, Taiwan card, now obviously the Xinjiang card. It has been, you know, as I mentioned, it has got its own agenda, political agenda, to destabilize and also to suppress the rise and development of China. So that is actually the consistent aim. Whatever, you know, the United States has got as its imminent, you know, tasks, but actually the long-term, you know, purpose is always to suppress the development of China. So as a result, obviously, this bill definitely will be casting a further shadow. The bilateral relations between China and the United States has already been, deteriorating, and the lowest ebb almost. So if any further, deterioration would even, push the bilateral relations to even lower, nadir, that is definitely something that is quite worrying.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Professor Chen and Mario. Let's move on to something closer between China and India. So following deadly clashes, the first in decades actually, between China and India over the border area, both countries have expressed little desire to further escalate the tension in the region. Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India have said that there was no outside incursion into Indian territory in Ladakh, nor had any border post of the Indian army been captured by an outside force, meaning the Chinese soldiers. Such an acknowledgement, I would say, may help lay the foundation to resolve the recent conflict between the two neighbors. So joining us now via Skype from New Delhi is Atu Anija, Strategic Affairs Editor of The Hindu. Welcome to the show, Atu.
Thank you.
So, we have this fierce physical fight broke out between the Chinese-Indian border guards in the Galvan Valley, close to the line of actual control, causing casualties on both sides. So this is the most serious border conflict between the two countries in many, many years. So Atu, what's behind the border standoff? How did it all begin here?
Well, there is one fundamental issue, which is that our borders are not defined. That there is a de facto border which is called the line of actual control. But it's not a settled border between the two countries. So that's the fundamental problem. There are areas which China consider its own side of the line of actual control. There are areas which India consider its own side. So there is no convergence exactly on the alignment of the line of actual control. So that's the basic. That's a fundamental problem which has happened. Mm-hmm. I think there is a secondary layer to it. And I think that at the end of the day, it's the mistrust between the two countries which has caused such a situation as this fight the other day, which led to the deaths on both sides in the Galwan Valley. Now, if I develop the point a little further, I think it can be traced to misconceptions about India's abrogation of Article 370, which took place on August 5, 2019. I presume, of course, China protested very strongly along with Pakistan about this change. Presuming that this change will affect the status quo on the borders, primarily on, I think China was concerned about Xinjiang, which links Xinjiang and Tibet, which was assumed somehow to be compromised. That area is claimed by India, but that has been the case prior to August 5, 2019. Then there was probably the fear that India might want to recover Gilgit-Baltistan, which again is disputed territory between India and Pakistan across the line of control. And coupled with that was that many of China's CPEC projects are passing through that. So I think there was this misconception that somehow Article 370 is going to alter this arrangement status quo, which has been there for some time. Mm-hmm. I remember I was in Beijing when on August 12, 2019, our foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, had come to Beijing. And during the meeting with Foreign Minister and State Councillor Wang Yi, he categorically clarified that the abrogation of Article 370 will have no bearing on the status quo on the boundaries. And he was also asked, and he said so in a press conference with the Indian media, that the Chinese side also asked me about Pakistan. And he said that I reassured them that there will be no change in the status quo along the line of control. I think those assurances should have been sufficient to assuage any Chinese anxieties. But unfortunately, I think that has not happened. The mistrust has prevailed. And following that, from then onwards, despite the Chennai informal summit between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, those fears have continued. I think that there's a third layer which gets added, that is that India is moving too closely to the United States, to the Quad and other arrangements, which my personal view is that's really not happening, and especially I've come back to New Delhi from Beijing and have got some access to what's happening in decision making. But I think these are the misconceptions. There is a lot of mistrust, and that is in the absence of a very active dialogue where these issues can be addressed. I think it leads to tragedies like this, which we saw in the Galwan Valley.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, there are many, many elements leading up to this tension
Sure.
or the recent incident.
Sure.
So I want to have Professor Chen Hong, your opinion about, why are the tensions rising now? And are there fundamental issues that China and India somehow they can't really settle here?
Well, I don't think actually, there are any, issues that are standing out, that cannot really be settled. I think actually the border disputes between India and China are actually the vestiges of the colonial period when the British colonizers were leaving India. Actually, they left, those unresolved disputes, for, China and India to sort out, and that has been actually the problems. I think that both sides, actually both China and India, have been exerting the utmost restraint in controlling the situation. For example, since the border war between the two countries, not a single shot, bullet shot, had been fired between the two countries' armies. Between these two countries, only clashes were actually simply like scuffles, hand to hand, the skirmishes. Those actually are indication of a kind of restraint exerted on both sides. I think actually in India, I think people should be actually bearing in mind that actually there's no good to stoke up those nationalist sentiments, trying to stoke up such anti-China sentiments. That will actually amount to nothing, and that will really solve no problems. I think both sides need to, China and India both are actually the largest developing countries. Both are actually the biggest economies in the world, the second and also the fifth largest economies in the world. So I think actually there are a lot of things that the two countries can collaborate, can work hand in hand, instead of letting the differences and contestations deteriorating into confrontation or even worse.
Mm-hmm. Well, too, obviously, as Professor Chen mentioned, there's at least a temporary, there's this rising nationalism. India, people are calling for boycotting of Chinese products or services. So looking ahead, obviously, two foreign ministers between China and India, they talk to each other, trying to find out, starting a conversation, seek the common ground to solve this problem. Looking forward, what do you think we need to do to bring the two countries to reduce the misperception, mistrust, to increase actually the understanding of each other, so to help solve this problem?
Well, I don't think we should shy away from resolving the border. I think the time has arrived when India and China sit down. We have been talking since the beginning of this century, and through the special representative mechanism, we have arrived at certain principles of resolving the border. So far, we have been focusing on what are called confidence building measures, which means that in case there is a face-off, there are certain rules of engagement which prevent military kind of a skirmish and use of firearms. I think that those are detailed confidence building measures which started from 1993 onwards. I think they have served their purpose well, but we need to go beyond this, because if you want an Asian century to come and India and China to actively cooperate, then this border issue has to be resolved, because this is coming in our way. Right from the time when President Xi visited India in 2014, we had that incident. Then there have been subsequent times when this has happened. So this has been a constant kind of a thorn in our flesh, and I think we need to sit down and resolve, just as China had done with Russia at one point in time. There was a border war in 1969, but by 2005, it had been resolved because the Chinese and the Russian side felt that the time has come to resolve.
They do need to sit down and talk to each other to help find out a way, to build the confidence. Well, thank you, too, for that. So let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's Newsmaker. Well, recently, former National Security Advisor of the United States, John Bolton's bombshell book on Donald Trump hits the headlines. So we have Mario back here. And although the book hasn't been published yet, it will go on sale on June 23rd. So the U.S. media has already published, some extracts. So Mario, I mean, because the general election is upcoming, is less than 5 months. So what kind of impact that will be? I mean, the book's release will be on Trump's chances of getting reelected, let's say.
On the question of whether this book is going to have a substantial impact on Trump's reelection, the answer is it's not going to have any impact at all. Mm-hmm. And that's the truth. And if anyone understands the situation with President Trump, they understand the fact. The fact is that he has supporters who will support him through thick and thin, no matter what. And they will view 100% of what Bolton says in this book as, at best, half-truths, lies, and so they don't care. In other words, I'm going to vote for Trump. I don't care what a guy named John Bolton has to say. I know that my president is not perfect and he's got this crazy personality, but that's why I voted for him, and I'm going to vote for him again in November. That's what they're thinking, so it's not going to have any impact, to answer your question.
Mm-hmm. Well, if Bolton saw all this, up close, a lot of revelations about the president in a very negative light, so why didn't he speak out, against the president or to stop the president? That's a question, I think, from the Democrats. That's a legitimate one, right?
It's a very legitimate question to ask, is what is going on with the revelations, and actually whether or not we should actually even call them revelations. For example, he talked about, and it's in our talking points for today, I've been researching this, about NATO. Okay, he tries to paint everything black. This is what they do in American politics. It's strategy to politicize, to demonize, to sensationalize any subject, whether it's China, or if you're attacking Trump because you're a leftist Democrat, then you're going to attack Trump. You politicize, you demonize, you sensationalize, and you paint everything black. You can't paint black Donald Trump's wonderful policy on NATO. Mm-hmm. How can you say he did anything wrong there? He said every country is supposed to be paying 2% of their GDP, and they're not. And we are, so we're covering for all of you. You all need to start paying your fair share. I can't believe anyone would disagree with that, and yet Bolton tries to paint that as being something.
And briefly, just 1 minute left. How do you characterize John Bolton? He's, people say he's a warmonger. He loves to have war probably with more than Iraq or Syria, right? And now he's coming out to criticize Donald Trump. Do you have strong confidence or belief in John Bolton?
As you know, from many times I've been on the show, when it comes to Trump, it surprises people sometimes that I don't attack him with everybody else. I'm a centrist. When Trump is right, he's right, as I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And if he's wrong, he's wrong. I'm certain that there's some truth in what Bolton has to say, as well as we're certain that there's some truth in what Donald Trump has to say. But it's how everyone tries to paint what it is. Like with China. We say something's happening with China, like the Xinjiang issue, and they try to paint it black and ascribe evil to it. They do the same thing with Donald Trump. Whatever it is he has to say, they're going to paint it in the worst possible light.
Sorry
Even
to cut you off there, Mario. With that, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on the YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for watching. See you next week.